Most investors believe they are diversified, but in Italy, they are not. Roughly 30% of the entire stock market traces back to a single family, and most people exposed to it do not even know it. That means if you hold European equities, pensions, or index funds, your risk may already be concentrated without you seeing it. In Italy, there is one family that controls Ferrari, Jeep, Chrysler, Maserati, and The Economist, and they own a soccer team worth over $2 billion and influence Italy's largest bank. The Agnellis oversee roughly 30% of Italy's stock market and employ more than 360,000 people worldwide, which means pension exposure, index funds, insurance reserves, and corporate collateral repeatedly trace back to the same ownership network. Most people have never heard their name. They are not simply Italy's Rockefellers. They sit at the intersection of industrial output, credit allocation, and information flow, where growth can accelerate or stall, where confidence can compound or fracture. And once that leverage concentrates, market diversification becomes structural illusion rather than distributed risk. The structure looks diversified on paper, and in practice, capital flows through overlapping control points that rarely appear in public reporting. When 30% of a national equity market traces back to a single ownership structure, it means institutional portfolios, pension funds, index trackers, and bank collateral frameworks are indirectly exposed to the same control center. Board votes across multiple blue-chip firms no longer represent dispersed shareholder democracy. They begin to reflect coordinated capital. Dividend flows, cross-holdings, and voting rights reinforce one another, and capital allocation decisions ripple through sectors simultaneously rather than independently. Credit exposure compounds inside the same network. Controlling Italy's largest bank means influence over lending terms, refinancing windows, covenant flexibility, and liquidity prioritization. And it means access to balance sheet intelligence across corporate Italy before that information reaches markets. When industrial ownership and credit distribution sit under overlapping influence, financial pressure can be applied quietly through interest rates, restructuring terms, or capital access. When liquidity contracts, companies do not fail because of headlines. They fail because they cannot refinance. And influence over a major bank means influence over that refinancing window. In Italy, power rarely changes hands because it passes down bloodlines from palaces to boardrooms. And while families like the Benettins in infrastructure, the Piralesis in industry, and the Berlusconis in media have each shaped a sector, none consolidated reach the way the Agnellis did. They built or absorbed the country's most recognized companies, turned culture into capital, and converted business scale into political gravity, until government policy often moved in sync with Fiat's needs rather than the other way around. At their peak, Gianni Agnelli's companies alone accounted for nearly 8% of Italy's GDP. In sovereign markets, industrial concentration at that scale affects credit outlook assessments and fiscal durability assumptions, and bond investors price national stability partly through corporate resilience. That figure is not symbolic. It means payroll concentration, supplier dependency, tax revenue reliance, export earnings, and banking exposure converge in one industrial ecosystem. When 8% of output moves under a unified strategic direction, fiscal stability and corporate strategy begin to overlap. Sovereign bond spreads react to industrial performance, and industrial performance reacts to credit conditions, and credit conditions are influenced by the same network that dominates production. Once that level of dependence forms, the option of clean separation disappears because any break would hit employment and output before it hits the family. And more importantly, it would hit bank balance sheets holding industrial debt, pension funds holding industrial equity, and municipalities reliant on industrial tax flows. But before the Agnellis became the face of Italian capitalism, they were a small family in Turin with one bold idea: build cars for a country that barely had roads. The year was 1899. Italy was still a young nation, the north industrializing while much of the country remained rural and poor, and Giovanni Agnelli, with a military past and a sharp instinct for opportunity, chose to bet on engines and speed while others clung to tradition. With a small group of investors, he founded Fabbrica Italiana Automobili Torino, Fiat, and in doing so, committed capital to a market that did not yet exist, closing off the safer path of waiting for proof and forcing every next move to justify sunk costs rather than reconsider the premise. That commitment meant fixed industrial assets, tooling investments, wage obligations, and inventory risk before a financing ecosystem for consumer auto purchases existed. It meant growth would not be optional. It would be required to amortize capital expenditure and scaling production, not for prestige, but to protect return on invested capital. By 1900, the first factory opened, and Agnelli took command as managing director, overseeing 35 workers who built 24 cars that year. And it sounded small, but cars were still foreign to Italy. Roads were scarce, and no demand was guaranteed. So by building supply first, he forced the country to adapt around him, making retreat harder with every payroll cycle. Payroll cycles create fixed cost pressure that forces revenue expansion, and expansion depends on financing flexibility and investor confidence. By 1904, production had grown five-fold, and by 1906, Fiat was producing over 1,000 cars and had opened a dealership in New York before most Italians owned one, a move that shifted Fiat from local experiment to international contender and made failure visible beyond Italy. International exposure meant foreign revenue streams, exchange risk, and dependence on cross-border capital flows. And it also meant external validation from foreign investors, which influences domestic valuation. That same year, Fiat became a corporation, and Giovanni, who had begun as a junior partner, maneuvered into full control, buying critical patents and installing modern production methods that locked in technological advantage while narrowing the chance of rivals catching up, and narrowing his own ability to change course without writing off the machinery of expansion. Patent ownership created intangible asset leverage, and production modernization increased capital intensity, and capital intensity increased dependency on scale, and scale increased exposure to credit cycles. Success, however, exposed the first crack. In 1908, Fiat was rocked by a financial scandal. Rumors of falsified accounts and inflated share prices spread. The board resigned, and Giovanni Agnelli was dragged to court, accused of manipulating stock prices for profit. The prosecutors failed to prove the case, and he walked free. But reputational damage does not vanish with a verdict, and after a public trial, the option of operating quietly was gone. A public challenge to accounting integrity does more than stain reputation. It alters how lenders price risk. When investors question valuation, equity becomes more volatile collateral. And when collateral becomes volatile, borrowing costs rise or access tightens. Fiat's future expansion would now require either deeper retained earnings or stronger political insulation from capital markets. The scandal forced him to abandon naivety. He became more strategic, more guarded, and far more selective about alliances, because once trust breaks, survival has to be purchased through leverage that cannot be taken away by headlines. And market trust can evaporate, but political protection can anchor capital access. When World War I broke out, hesitation would have meant vulnerability. So Agnelli moved fast, and he secured military contracts, scaled production, and shifted Fiat's factories overnight into wartime output: trucks, tanks, airplanes, tractors, diesel engines, tying his company's fate to the nation's security so tightly that dismantling Fiat would have meant weakening Italy itself. That commitment removed the option of Fiat being treated as just another firm, because now the state's continuity and Fiat's continuity were fused. When a company becomes embedded in national defense spending, its failure becomes politically expensive, and failure becomes politically expensive. Creditors price that implicit backing into lending terms. By the war's height, Fiat employed over 30,000 workers, profits surged, and accusations of war profiteering grew louder, threatening to erode the legitimacy he had just reinforced and narrowing the window in which he could defend the company without conceding control. After that pivot, Fiat could no longer survive on business results alone. From that point forward, access to capital depended as much on political alignment as industrial performance. Because once wartime profits are publicly visible, financial success becomes political vulnerability. High margins attract scrutiny, and scrutiny invites regulation, and regulation constrains pricing flexibility. Faced with that pressure, Agnelli chose cover in politics and aligned himself with Benito Mussolini, a rising nationalist figure. In 1914, he funded Mussolini's movement, and when criticism over wartime profits intensified, Mussolini repaid the favor by erasing the company's record, transforming potential liability into protected status. Erasing records does not just neutralize legal risk, it preserves access to capital. It maintains creditworthiness, and it protects supplier confidence, and it stabilizes equity valuation. Once protection replaced accountability, financial continuity depended less on market approval and more on regime alignment. The alliance paid off. By the late 1930s, Fiat employed over 50,000 workers and dominated Italy's industrial landscape. But that dominance bound the company to the regime's trajectory, making neutrality impossible when the regime's fortunes turned. Dominance at that scale means suppliers extend trade credit under the assumption of continuity. Banks extend loans under the assumption of political stability. And regions build infrastructure around industrial output forecasts. And financial exposure accumulates around a single industrial anchor. When World War II erupted, Fiat's assembly lines shifted again to tanks, trucks, and aircraft engines for Mussolini's army. And when Italy sided with Nazi Germany, the supply chain continued. And that continuation removed the option of later claiming distance, because production left a trail that could not be relabeled once the tide shifted. Wartime production embeds capital into machinery configured for military output. It increases dependency on state budgets, and it narrows diversification, and it amplifies exposure to regime survival. As the war turned against Italy, Giovanni shifted tone, voicing sympathy for the Allies in an attempt to preserve Fiat and the family name. But repositioning late does not erase prior commitments, and late sympathy cannot undo wartime output already delivered. Capital accumulated during war remains on the balance sheet regardless of narrative shifts. In 1945, Italian authorities temporarily seized Agnelli's assets for fascist collaboration. Yet dismantling Fiat would have destabilized the national economy, so punishment proved short-lived. And survival once again depended on indispensability rather than innocence, locking the lesson into the system that size itself is the shield. Dismantling a firm employing tens of thousands would have impaired banks holding industrial loans, municipalities dependent on tax receipts, and suppliers dependent on receivables. Liquidation would not only punish ownership, it would reverberate through the financial system. Systemic scale converted accountability into negotiation, and that survival cleared the way for a new generation. Giovanni's grandson, Gianni Agnelli, took charge in 1945, determined to earn and control power in a country rebuilding from ruins. Once the dynasty survived collaboration consequences, the option of a clean moral reset was no longer on the table. Continuity became the asset. Continuity preserved cross-shareholdings, preserved voting blocks, preserved industrial collateral. It preserved capital concentration through political transition. By 1963, he was managing director, and by 1966, chairman and CEO, consolidating authority at a moment when Italy's recovery needed industrial anchors, which meant government could not easily threaten the engine it relied on. Industrial recovery requires financing, and financing requires confidence, and confidence gravitates toward scale. Fiat's scale made it central to Reconstruction credit flows. He pushed beyond ideology, partnering with the Soviet Union during the Cold War to build a factory capable of producing more than 500,000 cars a year, demonstrating that profit could outrun political lines and locking Fiat into global markets that no longer depended solely on Italian demand, making any future domestic slowdown less able to discipline the company. Diversifying production geographically diversifies revenue risk. Foreign manufacturing reduces domestic cyclical dependency, and it strengthens bargaining power with lenders, and it stabilizes consolidated earnings. Under Gianni, Fiat absorbed Ferrari, Alfa Romeo, Lancia, and Maserati, stamping its logo from Moscow to Sao Paulo and turning Italian engineering into an empire. Acquisitions concentrate brand equity, intellectual property, and pricing power. They reduce internal competition, and they centralize supply chains. And they increase negotiating leverage with parts suppliers and distributors. Once those names were folded in, the option of competitors remaining independent national symbols shrank, because the family's portfolio became the country's brand. Brand consolidation increases intangible asset value, and intangible assets enhance valuation multiples, and higher valuation multiples improve equity leverage. By his final years, Fiat had won 7 European Car of the Year awards and employed over 200,000 people, and 1 in 5 Italians working in manufacturing had some link to Fiat or its suppliers. That level of employment density transforms a corporation into a macroeconomic variable. Wage negotiations influence consumption patterns, and supplier credit exposure influences regional banks, and output targets influence export data. Entire towns revolved around its production lines. A job at Fiat meant stability and belonging, and that social dependence made political confrontation increasingly costly, because any hard move against Fiat would first punish voters and regions before it punished executives. Political cost translates into regulatory hesitation, and regulatory hesitation translates into operating flexibility. Confident, Gianni set his sights on France and Citroën, Europe's second-largest automaker. Negotiations with the Michelin family advanced, and, if completed, Fiat would have ruled the continent's roads. Continental consolidation would have amplified market share, strengthened pricing coordination, and increased capital concentration across European automotive production. But French President Charles de Gaulle blocked the deal, forcing Fiat to settle for a 15% stake. Political sovereignty imposed the ceiling on cross-border capital expansion. It demonstrated that even dominant industrial balance sheets could be constrained by national regulatory authority. Once the deal was blocked at the head of state level, the option of expanding purely through industrial bargaining closed, because political veto proved it could override balance sheets. The setback exposed a limit. Factories and workforce were not enough when national sovereignty intervened. And from that moment, the Agnellis began recalibrating, recognizing that influence over narratives might counterbalance political resistance, because without narrative leverage, a single decision could still stop the next consolidation. After that ceiling was demonstrated, the next expansion could not begin in boardrooms alone. It would require influence over how economic power was perceived, debated, and regulated. Gianni had owned La Stampa, but under John Elkann, the strategy expanded. Through Exor, the family's holding company, the Agnellis acquired a 43.7% stake in Jedi, Italy's largest media group, worth over $102 million, taking control of La Repubblica, La Stampa, 13 regional newspapers, and Radio DJ. And once that stake transferred, the option of Italy's major outlets sitting outside the family's orbit narrowed sharply, because control was no longer scattered across unrelated owners. Media ownership is not only cultural influence, it is valuation influence. Financial journalism shapes risk perception. Risk perception shapes bond spreads, equity multiples, and access to international capital. Coverage affects how investors interpret labor disputes, regulatory actions, merger attempts, and earnings disappointments. When the same capital structure that dominates industry also shapes the narrative around that industry, volatility can be moderated before it compounds into financing stress. The shares came from CIR, the holding company of the De Benedetti family, long intertwined with progressive politics. And with that transfer, the country's narrative shifted from one power circle to another, closing off neutrality in the information space and making opposition costlier, because the platform itself was now part of the family's structure. Control over narrative reduces uncertainty premiums, and lower uncertainty premiums reduce cost of capital. And lower cost of capital increases competitive advantage in acquisitions and refinancing cycles. In 2015, Exor acquired 43.4% of The Economist Group, extending reach into international decision-making circles, where coverage shapes investor sentiment and policy framing. After that acquisition, the option of keeping the family's influence contained within Italian borders weakened, because the same voice now sat inside a global weekly read by the circles that price risk. Global readership means influence over how Italy's fiscal stability, industrial outlook, and regulatory shifts are interpreted abroad. Sovereign debt pricing depends partly on international perception, and corporate bonds issued by Italian firms trade on global confidence. And narrative positioning affects the liquidity environment in which refinancing occurs. Influence now moved beyond factories into the pages that guide markets and ministries, embedding the Agnellis where perception becomes policy. And once embedded there, disentanglement becomes unlikely, because exit would mean surrendering an instrument that shapes how outsiders interpret Italy. The reach extended further. In 1983, Alberto Agnelli helped create the European Round Table of Industrialists, linking corporate power directly to Brussels decision-makers, signaling that Fiat's ambitions included shaping Europe's rules. Rule shaping is pre-regulatory positioning. It determines emissions standards, trade policy, competition law, and subsidy allocation before they are codified. Regulation shapes capital expenditure requirements, and capital expenditure requirements shape industry margins, and margins shape valuation and reinvestment capacity. Once rule shaping becomes part of the strategy, the option of being merely subject to regulation disappears. But so does the option of pretending outcomes are purely market-driven, because the family is now inside the pre-law rooms. In 2016, Exor moved its legal and fiscal base to the Netherlands, officially for simplification and international profile, but in practical terms to reduce legal constraints and increase flexibility, trading national anchoring for continental mobility and limiting Italy's direct leverage over the family's capital. And jurisdictional relocation also affects takeover defenses, dividend routing, and shareholder voting structures, effectively insulating strategic control from domestic political shifts while preserving access to European capital markets. Relocating the holding structure changes governance rules, shareholder protections, voting mechanisms, and takeover defenses. It alters how capital can be raised, how dividends are distributed, and how cross-border mergers are structured, and increases flexibility in tax planning and reduces exposure to domestic political shifts. After that move, Italy could no longer use domestic corporate rules to slow the next expansion. Key control rights now sat in a jurisdiction optimized for holding company efficiency rather than national accountability. With Exor now based in the Netherlands, by 2024 it held 10.1% of Clarivate, a New York-listed data and analytics company influencing decisions for universities, corporations, and governments, with the stake potentially rising to 17%. Data infrastructure is upstream of capital allocation, and universities decide research funding, and corporations decide R&D investment, and governments decide grant distribution and industrial priorities. Clarivate aggregates and ranks information that informs those decisions. Once positioned inside a firm that guides decisions, the option of relying on public information alone weakens, because influence concentrates earlier in the chain where decisions are formed. In capital markets, informational advantage shows up before valuation does. Visibility into patent clusters, pharmaceutical pipelines, and artificial intelligence research affects when capital enters a sector and when it exits. In an era where data shapes stock prices and policy direction, positioning inside such infrastructure grants early visibility into sectors from pharmaceuticals to artificial intelligence, allowing anticipation of funding flows and regulatory shifts before they crystallize publicly. Ownership across health, tech, energy, and industrials further entwined the family with Europe's most sensitive policy debates. And that entwinement reduces the number of clean exits because stepping back would mean unwinding stakes that now sit in policy-adjacent industries. Cultural power reinforced industrial and informational leverage. In 1923, Edoardo Agnelli became president of Juventus, binding the family to football, a unifying national passion, and each successor carried that bond forward. Revenue streams from media rights intersect with advertising markets, and loyalty translates into consumer behavior that can reinforce corporate ecosystems. Once identity is tied to a club that carries national emotion, the option of being seen as just industrial management shrinks, because loyalty and prestige become part of the asset base. In 1969, Fiat bought 50% of Ferrari, bridging mass mobility and elite luxury. And by 1988, increased ownership to 90%, including Enzo Ferrari shares. Luxury assets operate on different valuation logic than mass production. They command higher multiples, stronger margins, and global demand elasticity. And they diversify earning streams and enhance consolidated financial resilience. Once Ferrari shares were absorbed, the option of Ferrari serving as an untouchable independent symbol vanished, because the family now sat above both the working-class engine and the luxury halo. When Ferrari later went public, Exor secured 48.1% of the voting rights, ensuring control without full ownership. Authority was structurally embedded, not dependent on majority shares, and that structure removed the option of market trading alone, changing who decides. Dual-class or voting weight structures allow control to persist even when equity is widely distributed. It enables capital raising without surrendering decision authority. It converts public markets into financing tools without relinquishing strategic command. John Elkann now oversees a €40 billion empire stretching from Milan to Amsterdam and beyond, operating within business roundtables, think tanks, and foundations where policies are shaped before becoming law. When industrial capital, media influence, data positioning, banking exposure, and regulatory access converge under one holding structure, the result is not merely wealth concentration, but decision concentration. And decisions about investment, restructuring, employment, and expansion ripple outward through interconnected balance sheets. Once influence is exercised in rooms before rules are written, the option of challenging outcomes only after they are public is already too late, because the window closes upstream. Through networks modeled after families like the Wallenbergs and the Pritzkers, the Agnellis remain embedded in Europe's power structure, influencing EU discussions on green technology, mobility, and industrial competitiveness. Green transition policy determines subsidy allocation, and mobility regulation determines capital expenditure requirements. Industrial competitiveness initiatives determine where investment incentives flow. Their actions, like those of modern institutions around them, occur under constraint. Each move to preserve influence narrows future flexibility. Each expansion trades simplicity for entanglement. And every added layer makes reversal more expensive than continuation. From a small factory in Turin to the corridors of Brussels, the Agnellis shifted from building cars to shaping information, policy, and markets. Once that shift completed, the option of treating the empire as only industrial was gone, because control now ran through media, lobbying, and data. They outlasted monarchies, dictators, and political shifts without holding public office, turning national legacy into continental power. Stability became dependence. Denial grew costly. Delay locked in alliances. Responses narrowed into structural commitments. And now, disentanglement would risk the very system that sustains them. When ownership concentration intersects with banking exposure, regulatory access, and informational influence, capital mobility itself becomes conditional. So the question remains, as Europe balances democracy with dynastic continuity, whether its foundations are shaped more by elected cycles or by families that never truly left the rooms where decisions are made.